It didn't start with a bang. It started with silence. A silence so thick, so breathless, that even the walls of the Supreme Court seemed to hold their breath. They say history announces itself with fanfare, but sometimes it slips into the room quietly, disguised as a woman with calm eyes, a navy suit, and a voice that refused to tremble. What happens when the most sacred institution in America meets the most unapologetic voice of a generation? The morning light filtered through the grand windows of the Supreme Court like a cathedral. Stained in soft gold, it touched everything. The marble floors, the old wooden benches, even the sharp corners of tradition itself. There was tension already in the air. You could feel it in the pacing of the clerks, in the way the reporters whispered too quietly, eyes scanning the room, notepad pages trembling just slightly. And then she walked in. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. There was no music, no headline crawling across a screen, just the unmistakable sense that the room had shifted. Some looked at her with curiosity, others skepticism. But all eyes followed. She wasn't supposed to be there. A member of Congress walking into the highest court to argue a case? Unheard of, unsettling, unforgivable to some. But there she was, not demanding respect, earning it by simply standing there, grounded. The case? Henderson v. Texas. Outwardly, a voting rights dispute. Inwardly, a war for the soul of democracy. Jasmine had prepared for this moment the way others prepare for battle. She had studied case law until her eyes burned, rehearsed arguments until her voice cracked, trained with former clerks, constitutional scholars, even prosecutors who once stood on the other side of her courtroom. She wasn't here to perform. She was here to remind the court and the country who the law was supposed to serve. And somewhere on the bench, Justice Sotomayor could feel it. The pressure, the shift, the threat, maybe. Because Jasmine wasn't an attorney asking for permission. She was an elected official walking into sacred territory, and Sotomayor, a lifelong protector of that sanctum, felt it in her bones. There would be no warm welcome. Chief Justice Roberts opened the hearing with tradition. Neutral, predictable, then gave the floor to Jasmine Crockett. She stood. She didn't clear her throat, didn't stammer. Her voice came out clear, precise, grounded in something deeper than law, in people. Your Honours, she began. I appear not just as a legislator, but as a voice for communities who have waited too long to be seen in this chamber. A murmur of recognition from the gallery. She didn't quote Shakespeare. She quoted neighbourhoods, grandmothers, bus drivers, veterans, teachers, the people whose votes vanished behind redrawn lines and closed polling stations. The justices shifted in their seats. Justice Alito narrowed his eyes. Gorsuch looked away. Barrett raised her brows. And then, Sotomayor. She clenched her jaw. One tap of her index finger on the bench. She had heard enough. Congresswoman Crockett, she cut in, her voice as sharp as a scalpel. This courtroom is not a platform for political narrative. Please confine your remarks to constitutional arguments. It was cold, almost surgical. You could feel the room recoil. And for a second, just a second, Jasmine paused, but not out of fear, out of strategy. She looked at the justice, then she smiled, not out of defiance, out of knowing. Justice Sotomayor, she said evenly, with deep respect for your service, may I ask, what do you believe shaped the court's most pivotal decisions? Abstract law, or the human lives beneath it? The courtroom froze. Even the marble seemed to echo. Sotomayor stared, then blinked. But Jasmine wasn't done. She stepped forward slightly, voice steady. Brown v. Board wasn't born from theory. It was born from a child forced to walk miles to a segregated school. Gideon v. Wainwright wasn't a legal fantasy. It was about a man in a cell who couldn't afford a lawyer. She let the silence breathe, then softer. And I remember your confirmation hearings, Justice Sotomayor. I remember the story of your mother, of your own story. Sotomayor's posture shifted, slightly. It wasn't a concession, not yet, but something had cracked. The spell of formality. Jasmine reached into her jacket and pulled out her congressional oath, printed and worn. I swore to defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. She looked around the chamber, then back to the bench. That includes protecting the people's voice. Even here, even now, even when it makes others uncomfortable. A reporter dropped their pen, a clerk stopped typing, and the Chief Justice simply watched. A crack in tradition had just split open, and through it something was beginning to rise. The sky outside had begun to darken, not from weather, but from something heavier in the air, that electric stillness that arrives before a storm breaks. Inside the Supreme Court chamber, the quiet persisted, not as a pause, but as a recalibration. The tension hadn't left. It had simply shifted shape. Jasmine Crockett sat back down, but not before offering one last look toward the bench, a look that said, "I'm not finished." And the justices knew it. Behind the formal robes and granite authority, something unexpected had happened. A breach, not of decorum but of distance. The kind of distance that courts so carefully maintain between them and the country they serve. Jasmine had closed that space in a matter of minutes, not with rebellion but with reason. Now the question hung like humidity in summer. What would happen next? Reporters filed out of the chamber on break, their faces stunned, their hands shaking slightly as they sent the first headlines flying across the country. Crockett confronts court. A new voice echoes through marble halls. Sotomayor called out on personal legacy. In the hallway, a law professor from Georgetown muttered to no one in particular, "Did we just see the start of something?" But inside, the day was not yet done. The hearing resumed. The justices reassembled, and Jasmine stood again. The courtroom, despite its stillness, throbbed with expectation. She began not with citations, but with a breath. Then, "The law," she said, "is not an island." Somewhere, a pencil broke in someone's grip. It was never meant to be locked behind marble and rituals. It's supposed to live, to breathe, to respond to the people it governs. Justice Kavanaugh leaned forward. His eyes narrowed. "Congresswoman Crockett," he interjected, "surely you don't mean to say that the court must yield to every public sentiment. That is the road to populism, not principle." Jasmine met his gaze. "No, Justice. I mean that principle without people is just pride in disguise." Another hush. "This case, Henderson v. Texas, isn't about partisan advantage. It's about fundamental dignity, about the right to matter, not as a statistic, but as a human being." Justice Gorsuch raised his voice. "How would you reconcile your argument with the court's precedent in Shelby County?" Jasmine turned slightly toward him, composed. "I would ask the court why it considers protection from imaginary fraud more urgent than protection from real, lived suppression." Gasps, quiet ones, the kind that ripple rather than burst. And still she stood, unshaken. "In my district," she continued, "people have seen polling places vanish overnight. They've been mailed the wrong ballots. Some waited in line 6 hours, while others waited 6 minutes. And when they ask why, all they get is silence. The same kind of silence that justice often wears as a mask." Justice Sotomayor shifted in her seat, her fingers no longer tapping, her hand now resting on her chin. Jasmine noticed. Everyone did. "Justice Sotomayor," Jasmine said quietly, "I'm not here to undermine you. I'm here because your legacy showed me that this place could one day belong to someone like me." The words hung. "I believe in this court. I just believe it can be better." Somewhere in the gallery, a young girl, maybe 12, maybe 13, stared at her with wide eyes, clutching her school folder tight. Her teacher beside her leaned in, whispering something like, "Watch this, you'll never forget it." The hearing pressed on. The DOJ attorneys stepped in briefly. The legal technicalities rolled like ocean swells, but Jasmine's presence hadn't faded. It had embedded itself into the room. Then came the exchange that would dominate headlines for weeks. "Justice Sotomayor," voice soft but focused. "Congresswoman Crockett, earlier you invoked my own confirmation, my background, my story. Are you suggesting this court begin ruling from emotion?" Jasmine didn't hesitate. "No, Your Honor, I'm suggesting that you already do. Every justice who has ever shaped this court has done so with their worldview, their lens, their lived history." She paused. "What I'm asking is not for the law to become emotion. I'm asking for it to remain human." Silence. Then the softest nod from Justice Jackson, barely perceptible, but Jasmine saw it. "You've said in your own writings," she continued, "the life experience of each justice matters. I'm simply extending that truth to the people whose lives you interpret the law around." There it was again, that slow shift, the turning tide. Even Justice Roberts was watching differently now, less like a moderator, more like a student, one hand near his chin, leaning in slightly. Jasmine pressed forward. "In Congress, we're told constantly to keep things procedural, to follow protocol. And yet, protocol hasn't protected my constituents from being unheard." She pulled another card from her pocket. This is a voter registration card, belongs to a woman named Rosa Fields, 93 years old, voted in every election since 1956. Last year, her name mysteriously disappeared from the rolls. She held it up. She waited 3 hours to vote, with a cane, in the cold. No one fixed it. No one cared. She let the silence return, then said, "Tell me again why that's not relevant here." A shiver moved through the gallery. Not from cold, from truth. Justice Alito spoke up, trying to return the debate to doctrine. "We are not here to correct administrative errors. We are here to interpret the law." Jasmine turned slowly, then interpret it through her eyes. If the law can't protect someone who's done everything right, then what are we protecting? She sat back, not defeated, just allowing the echo to settle. A moment later, Justice Sotomayor asked a question no one expected. What would you have this court do? The room inhaled. Jasmine stood again, and this time her voice carried not just strength, but something else, hope. Affirm that the vote is sacred. Affirm that redistricting can't be weaponized against those already on the margins. Affirm that this court is still a place where the Constitution lives and breathes and serves. The pause was deliberate. "And if you can't do that," she said, "then at least admit that something has gone terribly wrong." The gavel didn't fall, because no one was ready for this to end. Even the justices seemed unsure of how to move forward, not because Jasmine Crockett had disrupted the court, but because she had reminded it of its purpose. Outside the chamber, the sky finally opened up. Rain fell, gentle but steady. Inside, the marble didn't shine quite the same. Something had changed, not visibly but undeniably. And Jasmine? She gathered her papers, offered a nod, and left the room. A few reporters chased after her. "Congresswoman, did you plan that?" She turned. "No, I just showed up ready." Back inside, the justices sat still for a long time, longer than usual. Justice Sotomayor finally stood, walked slowly from the bench, and as she passed the empty podium, she paused, just for a second, then kept walking. But those who saw it knew something had just begun. They say change rarely announces itself in real time, but what happened inside the Supreme Court that day? It wasn't quiet. Not really. Not if you were listening. The echo of Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's voice still lingered in the marble chamber, not in volume, but in weight. The kind of weight that settles behind your ribs, that travels with you, that makes you look at the law and your role in it a little differently. When the courtroom emptied that evening, something peculiar happened. Reporters didn't rush to the usual post-hearing chaos. There were no loud predictions or fast-talking analysts. They stood in huddled silence, watching the bench as if it might still speak, like the room had something left to say. Justice Sotomayor lingered. She remained seated for longer than expected, even after the others had filed out. Her fingers played with the hem of her robe. Her eyes rested not on the court files before her, but on the podium where Jasmine had stood. She wasn't thinking about protocol anymore. She was remembering. Not just Jasmine's words, but her own. From another time. From when she had stood before the Senate speaking about her mother, her diabetes, her childhood in the Bronx. She had believed then that those stories made her stronger. So why had she silenced another woman for doing the same? Later that night, in her private chambers, she couldn't sleep. Her clerk noticed the lights still glowing at 1:37 a.m. A copy of Jasmine Crockett's transcript lay open on her desk, beside old rulings from Brown, Gideon, and Shelby. She kept reading the same line over and over, then interpret it through her eyes. Meanwhile, miles away, Jasmine Crockett sat on her apartment's narrow balcony, her shoes kicked off, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't reflecting. She was bracing. The blowback would come. She knew that. The court is sacred, they would say. The tone was inappropriate. She crossed a line. This wasn't the place. And yet, where else was it supposed to happen? Her phone buzzed non-stop. Texts, mentions, news alerts. The video was everywhere now. Clipped, shared, memed, praised, dissected. But the most important message didn't come from a journalist. It came from a woman in Atlanta. She had written simply, "I didn't know we were allowed to speak to them like that." Jasmine stared at that message for a long time, aloud. The next morning, Washington woke up louder than it had the night before. Talk shows erupted. Some called her brilliant, others called her reckless. Legal podcasts unpacked every syllable. Editorials clashed. But underneath all of it was one shared recognition. Jasmine Crockett had done something that couldn't be ignored. She had spoken not at the court, but to it. And she had been heard. In the White House, senior aides debated whether to acknowledge the moment or remain neutral. In the House, some of her colleagues leaned in, some leaned away. And on the court itself, something shifted behind the scenes. Justice Sotomayor sent an internal memo requesting a closed-door conference with the bench to evaluate the evolving dynamics of public participation in constitutional proceedings. That had never happened before. It wasn't protocol, it was personal. When the justices met, there was hesitation. Justice Thomas, impassive as ever, said little. Justice Kagan leaned forward, listening. Roberts, always balancing, asked if the meeting should even be on record. But Justice Sotomayor, when she spoke, surprised them all. "I think I was wrong," she said. The room froze. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. That sentence cracked something open, not just among the justices, but in the idea that they too were still capable of change. That afternoon, a letter was sent to Jasmine Crockett's office. Not from the court, from a former civil rights attorney who had once clerked for Thurgood Marshall. He wrote, "I saw what you did. It reminded me of 1964, when we argued against a wall of silence and black robes. We didn't always win, but we always spoke. Thank you for reminding them of that." Meanwhile, law students across the country downloaded the audio. Professors revised their syllabi. University panels invited Jasmine to speak. Civic organizations flooded her inbox. But Jasmine? She kept mostly quiet. Because she wasn't interested in being a headline. She was interested in being effective. Back in court, the case continued. Henderson v. Texas wasn't just a moment anymore. It was now a referendum. And then came a development no one predicted. Justice Sotomayor asked for a second opportunity to address Congresswoman Crockett, not as part of the ruling, but in the form of a written acknowledgement attached to the opinion brief. She wrote, "Though our chambers differ in role, we serve the same Constitution, and we must never forget the people who carry it on their backs." It wasn't an apology, it was something more rare, a recognition, and it sent shockwaves through the legal world. When Jasmine read the footnote, she smiled for the first time in days, not because she had won, but because she hadn't backed down. That evening, she stood on a stage in a small Dallas community center. No marble columns, no press, just folding chairs and a few dozen citizens. She said, "You don't have to raise your voice to shake a room. You just have to speak from a place deeper than fear." A man in the back wiped a tear. A student took notes, and somewhere in the front row, a little girl whispered to her mother, "She sounds like she belongs there." And the mother whispered back, "She does." The chambers of the Supreme Court had never felt so porous. Usually, after a high-profile hearing, the walls would return to their protective silence, the bench untouched by emotion, the air sterilized by protocol. But not this time. This time, something human had breached the seal. Justice Sotomayor found herself rereading Crockett's words, not in the context of argument, but of invitation. An invitation to reckon, to reflect, to remember. She had spent her career reminding the legal world that life stories mattered. But now that someone had turned that mirror back toward her, she wasn't sure if she had welcomed it or resisted it out of instinct. It was a question she couldn't shake. In chambers, she asked her clerk, "What does the law become when it forgets the people it's meant to protect?" The clerk, barely out of law school, said nothing, just nodded. And outside those chambers, the country was watching. The video of Crockett's rebuke and reflection had eclipsed politics. It had become something else, something harder to define. Teachers played it in classrooms, pastors quoted it from pulpits, mothers and daughters discussed it across kitchen tables, not as drama, but as affirmation. And then came the backlash. The usual voices thundered through cable panels and digital columns. Disrespectful, dangerous precedent, erosion of judicial independence. But Crockett didn't flinch. She never had. Instead, she released a simple statement. The Supreme Court is not sacred because of who sits on it. It's sacred because of who it serves. That includes the people who've never stepped inside its doors. A tidal wave of support followed, but Jasmine wasn't celebrating. She was working, drafting new legislation aimed at voter protections, meeting with state leaders, reaching across lines most wouldn't dare cross, not because she expected agreement, but because she believed in the duty to try. In one of those meetings, a senior Republican lawmaker told her, "I don't agree with your politics, Congresswoman, but I respect the hell out of your spine." She smiled. "You don't have to agree. You just have to care about the people who are counting on us both." Meanwhile, something quieter happened. Justice Sotomayor requested a private meeting with Congresswoman Crockett. The message was clear. No media, no clerks, just two women. When Jasmine arrived, there was no formality, just a handshake and a moment of silence. Then Justice Sotomayor said what no one expected. "You held a mirror up to this institution, and to me, that takes courage, more than most realize." Jasmine didn't interrupt, she just listened. Then she replied, "You showed the country that brilliance can come from the Bronx. That story matters. I just ask that we not forget that, when others come with theirs." The justice's voice caught slightly. "I haven't forgotten, but I've sometimes forgotten to make space." Jasmine nodded. "We all do, but that space, that's where justice breathes." No formal statement followed the meeting. No press leak, but the tone at the court changed. In the weeks that followed, during oral arguments in unrelated cases, observers noted something subtle but undeniable. Justice Sotomayor asked more grounded questions, reached further into the human context, sought clarity not just on precedent, but on impact. And when the court finally delivered its decision on Henderson v. Texas, the ruling came with something unexpected. A concurrence written by Justice Sotomayor. Not binding, but blistering in its honesty. She wrote, "The right to vote is not merely procedural. It is a declaration of belonging, and when that right is threatened, so too is the legitimacy of this court." The concurring opinion was read aloud in part on the Senate floor. Jasmine sat in silence as it echoed through the chamber. Afterwards, a freshman senator approached her. "You changed something, didn't you?" She shook her head. "No, I reminded something, and it listened." That night on a podcast, she was asked if she feared backlash from powerful circles. She laughed softly. "I didn't come here to be liked by power. I came to make sure power sees who it's meant to serve." In the days that followed, civic engagement surged. Local elections saw a bump in early registrations. Civic classes requested copies of the hearing transcript. A movement began not in protests, but in questions. What does it mean to be heard? Where is the line between respect and silence? Who belongs in the room? And behind closed doors, legal scholars began revisiting how oral arguments might evolve to better reflect the people affected by rulings made behind polished wood. The court had not changed its structure, but it had, quietly, changed its posture. And sometimes posture changes everything. History rarely chooses its moments in advance. Sometimes it sneaks in on quiet feet. Other times it arrives in the form of a woman who refuses to let silence win. Weeks had passed since Jasmine Crockett stepped into the Supreme Court chamber, but the impact hadn't dulled. If anything, it had deepened. The ruling in Henderson v. Texas was now law. A narrow decision, but one that protected key provisions of the Voting Rights Act. On paper, it was a victory. But in reality, it was something bigger. It was a shift, in tone, in truth, in who gets to be heard. Justice Sotomayor's concurrence was cited in op-eds across the country. Students quoted it in senior papers. Judges referenced it in lower court opinions. And Jasmine? She didn't just return to Congress. She returned with fire. Her voice carried weight now, not just from media coverage, but from moral clarity. She became a key voice on the Judiciary Committee. Her words no longer echoed only through chambers, but through homes, churches, classrooms. In one appearance on a late-night show, the host asked, "Do you realize you created a blueprint for speaking truth to power?" Jasmine just smiled. "No, I created a reminder that the people don't work for the court works for the people." In the months that followed, a ripple turned into a wave. New legislation was proposed to ensure transparency in Supreme Court proceedings. Courtrooms around the country began opening new channels for public testimony. Young law students started citing the Crockett Exchange, not just as legal analysis, but as a civic awakening. And then something rare happened. Justice Sotomayor invited Jasmine to join a closed symposium on judicial engagement. The theme? Constitutional interpretation and the role of lived experience. There were no cameras, no microphones, but someone in the room later described it as the most honest legal dialogue they'd seen in a generation. Jasmine spoke last. Her words weren't rehearsed. They were real. She said this Constitution isn't static. It's a promise in progress, and it only becomes real when those entrusted to interpret it are willing to hear the people who carry its weight. There was no applause, just nods, some quiet tears, and for once, no rebuttal. Later that evening, Jasmine returned home to her district. It wasn't fanfare that greeted her. It was her neighbours, her community. A woman hugged her outside a gas station. "You made us feel like we mattered again." And Jasmine, for all her poise, nearly lost it. Not because of pride, but because that was always the point, to matter. In Washington, a mural went up a few blocks from the Capitol. It didn't show a gavel or a flag. It showed two women, one in robes, one in a navy suit. Both standing, both listening, and beneath them a single line. This court's legitimacy doesn't come from standing apart, it comes from standing with. In an interview months later, Justice Sotomayor was asked what she thought of that mural. She paused, then said, "It reminds me that power means nothing if it cannot be moved." And Jasmine? She didn't stop. She launched a national initiative to bring civic education back into underserved schools. She created a fellowship for first-gen law students. She kept showing up, not to perform, but to represent. And every time she entered a room, whether it had marble columns or folding chairs, people stood a little taller, not because of her, but because her presence reminded them of their own. So what does this story leave us with? Not just a moment, a model, not just rhetoric, resolve. It asks us to look beyond the robes, beyond the traditions, beyond the fear that says, you don't belong here. Because you do. Democracy was never meant to be a spectator sport. It was built to be personal. So if Jasmine Crockett stood in the highest court in the land and asked it to remember the people, what's stopping the rest of us from doing the same in our schools, our cities, our streets? This isn't the end. This is a beginning, and it belongs to all of us. If this story moved you, if you believe in voices that shake rooms and questions that challenge the powerful, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that their voice matters. And leave a comment below. What would you say if you had 5 minutes at the podium of power? Because the truth is, that podium doesn't belong to one woman. It belongs to all of us.